Hello, everyone. My name is Cassidy Diamond, and I am the Public Programs and Events Manager at IDA. And I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us tonight for what is going to be a really exciting conversation around Netflix's The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez. I just wanted to kick off the evening's event with a land acknowledgement. We come to you today from Los Angeles, which is on the occupied land of the Tongva and the Chumash people who have been stewards of this land for generations. We are very excited to have this conversation, so you don't need to hear more about me. I'm going to introduce you here to our moderator. Just one second. Sorry, technical issues. I'm going to introduce you to our moderator. We have Lorraine Ali. Welcome,
Hello.
Lorraine. Okay, I'm going to hand it to you.
Hello, thank you. I wanted to introduce the director and filmmaker, Brian Knappenberger. And let's see if we can get you on there. There you go.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
And producer, Garrett Thieroff, and also journalist. Thank you. We did it. We're here.
Thank you. We're here.
We're here. Well, thank you both for being here. And I actually feel really honored to moderate this because the series is such an impactful series and so important. So first, do you, Brian, just want to speak? I think in an earlier conversation, you called it a procedural in the child welfare space. Can you kind of explain a little bit more, like kind of what this is about and why you would call it that?
Yeah, I don't remember using those words, but the
was that you, Garrett?
That might have been.
I sometimes use those words. Yeah.
No, I was initially really fascinated by this story. With Garrett broke the story of Gabriel Fernandez in the LA Times, and I had heard about it. I, through conversations we had talked about maybe doing a film or something about it, and we weren't quite sure. But it really started for me when we applied and got permission to go into the courtroom and start to film the death penalty case of Isaro Aguirre. So for those who aren't familiar with the basics of this story, I mean, we do look at the death of the 8-year-old boy, Gabriel Fernandez, at the hands of his mother and her boyfriend, his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isaro Aguirre. And we started filming before we really knew if it was going to be a documentary or where we were going to go with it. We started filming this trial, and during the course of this death penalty case, witnesses would come to the stand, and they were just telling one of the most kind of harrowing and compelling stories I'd ever heard. And so, we just kept filming, kept trying to understand what happened, kept digging into Garrett's work and his long history in dealing with DCFS and the Board of Supervisors and the very Byzantine, LA County bureaucracy. And we began to understand how much bigger this story was even than what we were hearing in the courtroom. So one of the most significant, now I'm just sort of recapping with the story in general, one of the most significant elements of this was that the 4 caseworkers that were involved with Gabriel, who saw Gabriel before he died, were also charged criminally. And and it's the first time that we understood that had happened, or that it was extremely rare that this happens. And so we wanted to understand all of the ramifications of what had happened to Gabriel.
So Garrett, you were a journalist with the Los Angeles Times when you first started looking into this, and you discovered, and you kind of tripped upon this when you were looking at the homicide blotter, the homicide report we do in there of all the homicides in Los Angeles County, and just saw Gabriel's name there. what compelled you to sort of go down this road? Because I just want to say, for people who haven't seen this, this series just shows you the failures of these child welfare agencies. Continually, this boy was so abused, and as a parent, I watch this and I'm mortified. And you think, okay, well, you know, there's safety nets, there's safety nets, there's safety nets, but there are not. And you really captured that. What sent you down that road initially?
By that time, I had been covering child welfare for about 4 years. My first introduction to it had been fatalities, and because a law went into effect in 2009 that allowed us to like at least get basic details about each death that resulted from abuse and neglect. Prior to that, you know, the newsroom would sometimes get a whispered call from the coroner's office, or a source, you know, somewhere in the county bureaucracy would say, like, here's a death that's happened. I really think someone should take a look at it. But it was very catch as catch can. In 2009, that did change somewhat, and we were able to at least figure out how many deaths the government was attributing to abuse and neglect, and how many of those had some sort of DCFS history.
When you say DCFS, can you just explain?
Sorry, yeah.
That's all right.
It's the child welfare system. So this is the Child Protective Services Agency in Los Angeles. It's also the largest child protective services agency in the country. It's got thousands and thousands of social workers. It's almost the size of the LAPD. We very rarely hear about it, even though it makes, you know, to my mind, which one of the most fraught government decisions. I mean, it's one of the trickiest, most important decisions that the government makes, which is to evaluate a family and say you can be a family or not, or this is your family whether you like it or not. As I said, my introduction into it was the fatalities, and one of the things I knew by the time Gabriel came around was that the horrifying thing that this happens, you know, several times a month, typically, for an agency like this, you know, and it was kind of a rote process, that, you know, these fatalities happen. They have kind of a conveyor belt of activities that are supposed to take place, always ending with a recommendation that it never happen again. And then, of course, days later, it does. And one of the other details I knew by that point was that half of the deaths that occur in the county as a result of abuse and neglect do have experience with the Child Protective Services Agency. Mm. So it wasn't a complete shot in the dark when I saw Gabriel's name, that there would be history there. In fact, half the time there is. And so I knew that at that point.
So, Brian, when you're looking at this, and you said, you know, you're looking at the trials, but you're having to go for this series. You really go back into Gabriel's history, the family history. You talk to family members, you talk to first responders, you talk to people that were in the emergency room, all the way up to jurors. I mean, the access you guys got for this is incredible. But also, you know, you're dealing with this agency who's very secretive. So can you just talk about some of the challenges you faced trying to make this into, you know, a documentary? What you came up against and what you kind of did you expect it to be as difficult as it was, or?
Well, I didn't. Garrett's more seasoned with the LA County bureaucracy than I am. I've certainly brushed up against secretive governmental agencies before in my work, but I was more surprised probably than he was. I did expect them to engage us with us in a pretty honest and direct way. It was clear this was an important case. You know, Congresswoman Kara Bass said it rattled, shook LA County to its core. There's no question that's true. And so if indeed they had made a lot of changes based on what happened to Gabriel, like they said they did through the Blue Ribbon Commission and others, I did expect a more of a dialogue from them. The secrecy was impenetrable, it seemed like. So I got a taste of what Garrett deals with on a day-to-day basis with DCFS. But there's a lot of pushback. I mean, there's a lot of pushback. We got, saber rattling from lawyers. We got really got a daily runaround, for almost a year from the media people that, where they'd say we could do something and then they would kind of take it away. They would say, no, we can't. There'd be a change. We just weren't, I didn't feel like we were being dealt with in good faith for most of this, unfortunately. And that was actually one of the things that I was most disappointed by. I wanted to talk to Bobby Cagle, the current DCFS director. We wanted a more honest and direct conversation with the Board of Supervisors, who, made hurdles in our work. They tried to, they wanted to know what each chapter of the documentary was going to be. They wanted to know the thesis for each chapter. They wanted to know what our overall point was going to be. They wanted to look at scripts. This is all completely, it's not something, it's fairly, we're talking to an IDA crowd. It's pretty obviously not something we would agree to. So that was upsetting. One of the, I guess, maybe more dramatic aspects was Asaro Aguirre's legal team actually tried to suppress the documentary, filed a motion to suppress the documentary with prior restraint and prohibit us from actually publishing the documentary until all of his legal appeals were exhausted, which in a death penalty case could have been decades. So we had to fight that in court, and of course we won. But it was those sorts of things we were dealing with on a pretty regular basis.
Well, what you really get just watching this is that what you're saying is I was surprised at that secrecy. You would expect it at a high government level. You would expect it I just would not expect it in an agency that, is supposed to be looking after the welfare of children, right? And it's like, well, and you really get it, like, well, what is it about this secrecy? And then kind of break down the systemic failures of this whole agency. One of them, and I thought you laid out so beautifully here, is that often they're approaching these cases, and Gabriel's, and I'll just give a little bit of background from what I learned from this, is that there was multiple reports from teachers, from the security guard, from relatives about, his abuse. When social service workers were approaching the family, they were doing it with the parent in mind rather than the child. And over, this seemed to be the case. And I think you really documented that well. Garrett, is in your reporting, do you think this story would have come out, or do you think there would have been any kind of justice if you hadn't done that reporting? It just seems like it would have been another blotter name.
Yeah, without being self-congratulatory, no, I don't think that it would have come out if we hadn't set out to do it. When I first started covering this agency, it's an agency that had forgotten what procedure was in place to do for a journalist to obtain a ride-along. It's an agency that had forgotten what the process was to obtain death records. All of these things, when I presented these requests, they were landing with top officials who were like saying, I don't know how to do that. And we'd have to kind of like step by step, patiently figure that out. And I think that it requires an enormous amount of time. I can't emphasize how much time goes on in conversations with attorneys, with, working on our side and working, sometimes cooperatively on the other side as well, although not always in good faith. And I would agree with Brian that those conversations weren't always in good faith, but that made us bend over even more backwards, even more to try to get the perspective of the agency fully in the story. I think that partly because this is such time-intensive work, it's so rarely done, and the standards for journalism in this arena, I think it's remarkable what we accept. We oftentimes news organizations, dedicate a reporter, maybe every decade they'll dedicate a reporter to this type of topic, and then they'll feel really good, like oh, look at how charitable we were for doing something like this. And whereas nobody bats an eye at all these other topics that get sustained coverage. So, you know, I don't think, I recognize how privileged I was to be working at the Los Angeles Times in a place that, like, you know, despite its difficulties and the obstacles, I think it's the only place that would have allowed me to do the initial reporting on this. I also think that, you know, I now work at the investigative reporting program at UC Berkeley, which is also just one of the, you know, the only places in the country that I can imagine being able to continue this work. And then also with Brian and Netflix, and, you know, having these years, you know, I didn't want to do this documentary, and Brian didn't either, unless we were going to be able to significantly further the reporting. And, you know, there's entire lines of inquiry that that continued through over the years that we worked on this. And so I think that, like, you know, I really do think that this type of reporting only comes out under very unusual circumstances, unfortunately, which despite the extraordinary need. I mean, this is an agency that touches, you know, 1 out of 7 children in Los Angeles County are reported to the child abuse hotline by the time they're 5 years old. For Black children, it's 1 out of 3. The reach that this agency has is absolutely extraordinary, and I think that the media has only begun to scratch the surface of the experiences that that children and families are having as a result of these interactions. And you know, I think, yeah.
Well, and I think, you know, Brian, in the series, it also explores all these different intersections where, you know, when you're talking about racial disparity and child welfare service, when you're talking about, and I think there's a term that you use in there also about the outsourcing of these child welfare agencies to private companies. And I think you guys called it the industrial poverty complex.
Yeah.
I hope I got that right. It was just really eye-opening in showing you this isn't just like this one little slice. Like you talked about law enforcement, about how people did or didn't take this family seriously, which has to do with race, economic standing, you know, so all of those things are kind of mixed in here. Did you expect to find that when you kind of went into the story?
It was clear that you know, when you're listening to testimony in the courtroom, that that was itself a really engaging kind of story. But what really sort of kind of brought it up was just understanding how much Gabriel's story touched on all of these sorts of things that you just mentioned. It really did. The story of this one boy who nobody listened to when he was alive really did just put into full relief so many different failures within the system, and not only just failures, but other just issues within the system. So yeah, it was that was something that seemed apparent early on, but then just got more and more clear as we went along. One, you mentioned the public-private partnerships, the poverty industrial complex. That was entirely a surprise to me. And we're interviewing this security guard at DPSS office, which is a place where people go to get a welfare benefits. And after listening to lots of people, you know, who saw Gabriel and didn't do anything, or worse, said they didn't see anything, or just tried to explain it away. This one security guard, Arturo Miranda, really saw Gabriel for about 10 minutes and made it his mission to try to save him. And just really, really moved by Arturo and the way his actions, and the way he was was able to put his job on the line it was willing to put his job on the line to do what he thought was right. It was so clear where he was coming from. And during that interview, he said that some of the employees at that place had worked for Maximus, a company called Maximus. I'd never heard of Maximus, and that they were urged, condensing parts here, but they were urged to maybe not make the call to the sheriffs and to protect Gabriel, because there was an overall culture where you weren't supposed to go into overtime, where you weren't supposed to spend extra money that way. And that was just shocking to me. Garrett had done some work with Maximus. And when we drilled down in there, his team did just an extraordinary amount of brand new reporting that's unique to the series on this public-private partnership. I mean, I think it was, I mean, Garrett can take over, but he was, this is a team of 2 or 3 people that through records requests had to go through thousands of documents, you know, that we received that were out of order purposefully to thwart us. And they found just extraordinary things within that.
I mean,
I feel like Garrett should talk because
I was just going to say, Garrett. I mean, I remarked, but I wanted to talk.
Sure. If you'd like me to add for a second, I mean,
it was an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, I mean, Maximus is one of these companies that it's a worldwide global corporation that carries out these all sorts of government activities, all, you know, in Saudi Arabia, in the UK, and also in Los Angeles. And it's also traditionally one of the top lobbyists for, you know, Los Angeles County. We think of it as a county, but it's, you know, it's the size of a country. You know, many countries are this size. And so the amount of money that they get from this contract is enormous. And they did play this pivotal role in Gabriel Fernandez's case because, you know, we had this courageous security guard. You know, he was able to see what nobody else was able to see, even though they were trained to do it. He immediately noticed that this is a child that is in desperate need of attention. And the way he was thwarted, like this extraordinarily, I mean, he's really an extraordinary person. He went to extraordinary lengths, and yet still he failed. And why did he fail? Well, he failed because the people working at this office, which is run by this company, said, well, it's the end of the day, we're tired, we don't pay overtime. And it is an agency that I had some experience with in the past. I knew that, like, the board of supervisors, members of the board of supervisors, as they were deciding the contract, would traditionally read from Maximus propaganda as they described why their vote was going to be taking place. I had sat there and seen that in the past. And even in this case, which is, you know, Gabriel Fernandez is by far like the most notorious, scrutinized case in a generation in the child welfare space. They had testimony to saying that this company thwarted these efforts. Yet even in the most scrutinized case that the agency has, you know, probably ever seen, they had never scrutinized the role of Maximus, and Maximus had never received any consequences whatsoever. And so I wanted to analyze that. And so I called them up, and they said, well, we're not gonna answer a single question about that. And they said, you know, and they anticipated my next step. They said, you know, file another one of your public records requests. And so we did that. And, yeah. And then we got, you know, rounds and rounds of documents, which they helpfully shuffled out of order. You know, we got thousands and thousands of pages that were shuffled out of order. And so one of the benefits of working at where I am now at the Investigative Reporting Program at Berkeley is that I'm able to collaborate with students. And so we, you know, the first step was just, it's pretty tedious. You know, you're just putting it into place. We built a timeline of what happened. We scrutinized, you know, thousands of pages to be able to just make the simple statement that no, they suffered no consequences. There was no corrective action. There was no significant review, and we also scrutinized political contributions. We were able to say that the deciding vote on the Board of Supervisors voted after his office was lobbied by his son's own lobbying firm, working on behalf of the company.
Wow. So I think another thing that this documentary shines a light on is local journalism, advocacy journalism. I know you hear it all the time of it's really important, we're losing it, you know, but like a place like the Los Angeles Times or local papers, they don't have the advertising they did. So the first thing that gets cut is, you know, local reporters like yourself. And the importance of that is a string throughout this whole thing. This boy would have never, he didn't live to see justice, but it happened because there was local journalism, and this film and the series happened because there was local journalism, and you lay that out so wonderfully, Brian. And I know it's not your world. It is, but it's not, you know?
I mean, it was definitely a conscious effort throughout it to make a point about local journalism. And during the course of this, I mean, we filmed with Garrett in the old LA Times building, which is this monument, really, in some ways. I mean, it's really just a classic old kind of landmark in Los Angeles. You know, right in the shadow of the police department. You know, it's diagonal from City Hall. It's right there next to the courthouse. I mean, it is the fourth estate. Symbolically in the city, it's the fourth estate. It's showing its presence there. And we filmed a little bit with Garrett there at the beginning. But by the end of this process, the LA Times was moving out of that building. And you know, that last interview I did with Shelby Grad from the LA Times, you know, there's boxes, they're packing up boxes in the background, and they're taking down, you know, bricks and stuff. I mean, they're really dismantling the place, and there was a stark symbolism, I think, to that.
Right.
But that was very much on my mind. My previous films, Nobody Speak, Trials of the Free Press, was bordered into this territory a little bit. But I am worried very much about local journalism. You know, bad things go on, but it's worse and everybody's kept in the dark. Right.
And I think one of the really compelling characters as you're moving along in this story is he's a prosecutor. Is it John Hatami?
Yeah.
Yeah, John. Yeah.
So he's, from, you know, what we're seeing as the viewers, is he's prosecuting the case against the boyfriend who, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, but
Isara. Yeah.
Yeah. And as he, you know, he's super dedicated, but as we roll on, we find out that he was also abused as a child. And when he's talking about the conditions that Gabriel lived in, I'm going to try to get through this without crying. You know, being locked in a cupboard, being fed cat food, being starved, all of those things you see as a human being, the impact it had on him and why this fight is so important. It's almost like he's battling for himself, for that kid as well. It's so beautifully kind of pulls it all together of the emotional depth of this. So I'm going to throw that out to either of you. Emotionally, I don't know how you got through this, or maybe you had to take some breaks, but it's moving.
Yeah. Well, I think that John had he more than anybody, I mean, and it makes me emotional as well to think about, but his experience as a child gave him a particular access to what Gabriel experienced. And I think that being steeped in it for such a long period of time gives him an unusual ability to express aspects of that experience. And I don't think that we would have such a powerful documentary without the gift that John gave us. I mean, he's an unusual public official. We worked really, really hard for a lot of interviews in this. And the moment he and I met in the elevator, he said, "I work for you. Of course I'll answer any questions. You know, I'm a public servant." You know, like he's just a truly remarkable person. And without him, we were very, very set upon telling a story from 360 degrees, you know, where the agency got its best argument, where the workers got their best argument. Everybody comes through, I hope, as a fully developed character. You know, we don't have any caricatures, but we did want to have Gabriel at the very center of the story. And I think that one of the things that John was able to do is to help us to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, I agree. He's just an extraordinary. It's hard to imagine this series without him and the drive that he gave to the case, and the understanding that he brought. I mean, it was very, very powerful, and still is. I mean, he's still completely dedicated to this case. And you know, one thing that should be mentioned, while we were making this, there was a series of deaths, child deaths in the Antelope Valley almost in rapid succession during a portion of this, and he's still working on those cases. I mean, it's pretty moving. I mean, from our perspective as a production, we actually realized that we needed to have people, someone for people to talk to when they were editors that were going through this footage a lot. Really, the rest of the crew lived with this footage and this story for almost 2 years, and we realized that it was kind of important that we figured out how to deal with that, and sometimes you don't realize the toll it's taking on you when your head is in the story and you're editing and you're figuring stuff out. So we actually had a therapist on call that was entirely anonymous. We just had a number of people could go to, someone that was in our building. We paid the bill, but we didn't have any other connection to it or knowledge of, and people could go whenever they wanted. And I think that helped. I think that helped the process a little bit.
Was the, and I'm sorry if this is a very broad question, but was the goal here, I know there's multiple goals when you're in a project, but was the goal to just seek some accountability? Because I don't know if we laid this out in the beginning, but these trials, there are 3 different trials. And I can't remember if we said this, but it's the social workers, it's the mother, the boyfriend who he called his stepfather. Was the goal of this to shine a light on this for accountability, or what did you both see going into this? Like this, and I'm talking specifically about this series, like what did you want this to achieve?
Go
on.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think, I think the best advocacy is just that you try to tell the truth on stories that people wouldn't have already known, to drag these kinds of stories out into the light of day and to understand what happened to them. I mean, this was a young boy who nobody listened to when he was alive. Nobody knew this story. Nobody heard him. Nobody took him seriously. So to have a platform like we had, to give it to him, basically, it was powerful. I mean, it was something that you want to do. It's the kind of voice you want to hear and you want to amplify.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's I'm not an advocate in the sense of like that I believe in any particular reform movement or any particular kind of like partisan perspective, but I do try to be very, very motivated by being an advocate for the topic itself. I think that by and large, we don't cover this topic nearly to the degree and with the seriousness that it deserves. And I think that we need, that as reporters who are, one of the, we're lucky enough to have our role enshrined in the Constitution. If we're gonna have that, we need to use that to add urgency and education to topics like this one. And I do think that there's a serious accountability element to that. I think that it was gratifying to me that there was space within this documentary to say, these are who made these votes. This is how it happened. And also the accountability to ourselves, as citizens in a democracy, that there have been elections where child welfare barely registered as a topic. And so I think that the accountability, I kind of view that very broadly. It's certainly not just the director of the agency's, responsibility to make sure that this is carried out appropriately. I think accountability is a complicated question, but it's certainly one of the motivating things that propelled us forward.
Yeah, in the end, it's a question of who are we, as a society, where do we want to put priorities? There's this song that we end the whole series with, was a Latin Playboys song that just sings this chorus: "This is what I am, this is what I am." And I had always remembered that song. It was the only song I felt would fit this, and they were kind enough to do a kind of rendition of it. But that was it. This is who we are. This is what we are. Can we do this better? Can we be better?
Thank you so much for talking about this. We did it without crying, sort of, almost.
I almost got it. I almost lost it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for doing it, Lauren. I really
No,
Thank you.
It's a beautiful series. And I think we're out of time.
Yes, we're just getting there. So thank you everyone for joining us. We were really glad to have this conversation, really important, really moving conversation. So I thank everyone. If you guys want to find out more about our screening series, you can go to documentary.org/awards-spotlight to find our upcoming questions. And thank you again, Lorraine, Brian, and Garrett. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for allowing us to speak about it.
Of course. Have a great night, everyone.